Welcome back to Sacred Arc, a podcast about life, loss, and the soul in between. I'm Kimberley, intuitive grief guide, death doula, licensed esthetician, and whether I wanted to be or not, a lifelong student of grief. There are some parts of grief that people talk about openly: sadness, heartbreak, loneliness, missing someone. But there are other parts of grief that often stay hidden, parts that people feel ashamed to admit, parts that don't always make sense logically. Parts that can leave someone questioning themselves long after loss. And one of those experiences is survivor's guilt. Survivor's guilt can happen after almost any kind of loss. The loss of a child, a sibling, a spouse, a parent, a friend, a coworker, a fellow veteran, someone lost to illness, an accident, suicide, addiction, natural disaster, violence. Even miscarriage and pregnancy loss can sometimes carry elements of survivor's guilt. At its core, survivor's guilt is often the struggle of being the one who remained, the one still here, the one who gets another birthday, another holiday, another chance, another morning when someone else did not. And while people often associate survivor's guilt with war or traumatic events, it shows up in grief far more often than many people realize. Because after loss, the mind begins searching for explanations, for control, for answers, and sometimes it lands on a question that can become incredibly painful. Why them and not me? I think one of the hardest things about survivor's guilt is that it often exists alongside love. The more someone mattered, the more likely we are to question ourselves after they're gone. People might find themselves thinking, I should have done more. I should have seen something. I should have called, I should have known, I should have prevented it, or I should have taken their place. Sometimes survivor's guilt sounds like responsibility. Sometimes it sounds like regret. Sometimes it sounds like bargaining, and sometimes it sounds like self-punishment. Because the mind is a tricky thing and it starts replaying conversations, decisions, missed opportunities, tiny details, looking for the moment where the outcome could have been different. And while that process is deeply human, it can also become exhausting, because grief often convinces us that certainty exists where it never actually did. I think survivor's guilt is often connected to something deeper: our struggle to accept how little control we sometimes have. As human beings, we want life to make sense. We want causes. We want explanations. We want a reason why terrible things happen, because if we can identify the reason, then maybe, just maybe, we could prevent it from happening again. Maybe we can feel safe again. But loss doesn't always offer those answers. And when life refuses to make sense, people often turn the blame inward, because carrying guilt can sometimes feel easier than carrying helplessness. If it's my fault, then at least there's an explanation. If I could have changed it, then maybe the world still feels predictable. But the reality is that many losses happen despite love, despite effort, despite vigilance, and despite doing everything right. And that truth can be incredibly painful to sit with. I think survivor's guilt becomes especially complicated for parents, because parents are wired to protect, to prevent harm, to keep their children safe. So when a child dies, many parents begin carrying questions that may never fully leave. Questions like, how did I not stop this? Could I have done something differently? What if I had noticed sooner? What if I had made another choice? Even when there was nothing they could have done. Even when the outcome was beyond anyone's control, the parental heart often continues searching, because love continues searching. And sometimes parents also struggle with something few people talk about: the guilt of continuing to live, continuing to laugh, continuing to have experiences, continuing to age when their child can't. Suicide loss often creates another layer, because unanswered questions remain. People replay messages, phone calls, conversations, missed signs, last interactions, looking for understanding, looking for a moment that could explain what happened. And many survivors carry an impossible burden, believing they should have been able to save someone from pain they may have never fully seen. But the truth is that loving someone and saving someone are not always the same thing. And accepting that can be one of the hardest parts of healing. One of the most recognized forms of survivor's guilt exists among veterans. But even though many people have heard the term, few truly understand what it feels like to carry. For some veterans, survivor's guilt begins on the battlefield. For others, it begins after they come home. And for some, it doesn't fully appear until years later. A veteran might find themselves asking, why did I survive when someone else didn't? Why was I standing here instead of there? Why did I come home when they never had the chance? Or why am I living this life while someone else's family had to bury theirs? These aren't simple questions, and they don't always have answers. Sometimes survivor's guilt is attached to a specific moment, a split-second decision, a different seat in a vehicle, a delayed departure, a route change, a mission assignment, or a choice that seemed insignificant at the time. And sometimes there is no specific moment at all. It's simply the reality of being alive when someone you cared about isn't. What makes military survivors' guilt especially difficult is that many veterans carry a deep sense of responsibility toward the people they served beside. They weren't just co-workers, they were brothers, sisters, friends, people who trusted each other with their lives. When someone dies, many veterans replay events repeatedly, looking for what they missed, looking for what they could have changed, looking for a version of the story where everyone came home. There's another layer that often receives less attention, the guilt of building a life afterward. The guilt of having children, getting married, celebrating birthdays, starting businesses, retiring, growing older, experiencing joy. Because part of them may still be thinking about the people who never got those opportunities, the people whose futures ended while theirs continued. And I think that's something many grieving people relate to, not only veterans, but veterans often experience it in a particularly intense way. Then there's another heartbreak, one Lance spoke about, one many veterans carry, the loss of fellow service members after the war is over. The brothers and sisters who survived combat only to later lose their lives to suicide. Because many veterans don't only grieve those who died overseas, they grieve the friends they lost years later. The people who came home physically but never fully escaped what they carried mentally. And that creates another painful question. We survived the war, so why couldn't we survive what came after it? That's a question many veterans wrestle with for years, sometimes decades. And I think that's what makes survivor's guilt so difficult, is that underneath all of it is love. Love for the people who were lost, love for the people who should still be here, love for the people whose absence never fully stops being felt. And sometimes survivor's guilt doesn't happen because someone died. Sometimes it happens because someone suffered differently. People might feel guilty because they survived an accident. Their cancer went into remission. Their treatment worked. Their sibling struggled more. Their friend had fewer opportunities, or their life turned out differently. And suddenly joy feels complicated. Success feels complicated. Peace feels complicated. Almost as if being okay somehow dishonors those who weren't given the same chance. I think many grieving people quietly struggle with the fear of moving forward. The fear that healing means leaving someone behind, because if the pain softens, does that mean I love them less? If I laugh, am I forgetting them? If I build a life again, am I betraying them? And I think survivor's guilt often lives in those questions too, the belief that suffering is proof of love. But suffering is not the same thing as devotion, and pain is not the only way we honor people. Sometimes honoring someone means continuing to live, continuing to love, continuing to experience life in ways they no longer can. I think one of the most healing things for survivor's guilt is learning how to separate responsibility from love. Because many grieving people carry a responsibility for things they never controlled, while overlooking the love they offered, the care they gave, the ways they showed up, the ways they tried. Another thing that helps is recognizing that hindsight creates an illusion. Looking backward always makes things appear clearer than they were in real time. We judge ourselves based on information we only have now, not for the information we had then. And that is not a fair comparison. I also think it helps to ask, would the person I love want me to spend the rest of my life punishing myself? Or would they want me to continue living? For most people, the answer is obvious, but allowing ourselves to believe it can take much longer. Whether someone lost a fellow soldier, a spouse, a child, a sibling, or a friend, survivor's guilt often grows from the same place. The belief that somehow we should have been able to change what happened, or the discomfort of continuing to live when someone else could not. But healing often begins when we recognize something difficult. Being alive is not something we have to apologize for. And continuing to live fully is not a betrayal of those we lost. In many ways, it may be one of the ways we can honor them the most. Before we close today's episode, I want you to know something. You're carrying survivor's guilt today. The fact that you are still asking these questions often speaks to the depth of your love, not the reality of your responsibility. You are allowed to stop carrying things that were never yours to hold. You are allowed to acknowledge that some outcomes existed beyond your control. You are allowed to miss someone deeply without blaming yourself for their absence. You are allowed to heal. You are allowed to laugh. You are allowed to feel joy again. And you are allowed to continue living. And none of those things diminish your love. I think survivor's guilt is ultimately a reflection of something very human, our desire to protect the people we love, our desire to make sense of loss, or our desire to believe that if we had just done one thing differently, the ending would have changed, but grief rarely offers certainty. And healing often begins when we stop demanding impossible answers from ourselves. The people we love do not need us to suffer forever to prove they mattered. They mattered already. And they matter still. If it feels okay for you, I want to invite you to close your eyes here. Just take a moment to center yourself if this episode brought up any feelings in you, any emotions. Take a slow breath in through your nose and gently exhale through your mouth. Now bring to mind the person that you're carrying today. And instead of asking, what should I have done? Ask yourself, how did I love them? And stay there for a moment in that, not in guilt, not in blame, but in love. Sometimes survivor's guilt keeps us looking backward for a different ending, but healing asks us a different question. How do we carry love forward from here? Because surviving when someone else couldn't is not a betrayal of their life. It's part of the responsibility of your own. This has been Sacred Arc. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you again in the space between.